The moment the photographs surfaced, they did not arrive as neutral evidence but as a carefully timed rupture in an already fragile emotional landscape. In the world of the bold and the beautiful, truth rarely announces itself cleanly. It arrives fragmented, framed, and sharpened by the circumstances of its release. Dylan's decision to post the images precisely when Carter Walton was forced to reappear at Forrester Creations over urgent legal matters ensured that interpretation would outrun verification. The timing alone felt accusatory. It suggested intention where there may have been only coincidence, strategy where there may have been fear, and betrayal where there may have been nothing more than survival. Within minutes, a narrative took hold, one that painted Electra Forrester as a woman who seized the chaos of Will Spencer's distraction to gravitate toward a man with greater authority and influence. The power of scandal lies not in its accuracy, but in its simplicity. A single image can eclipse context, flatten complexity, and convert ambiguity into certainty. In those photographs, Electra and Carter appeared closer than propriety would suggest, faces angled, hands placed where hands should not linger, proximity implying intimacy. To the casual observer, the conclusion felt obvious and damning. If Will was unavailable, overwhelmed by his own obligations, then Electra's supposed pivot toward a more powerful presence seemed not only plausible but predictable. That was the story the images told, and in a world conditioned to consume drama quickly, the story was accepted as truth before anyone stopped to ask what had actually happened in the seconds before the shutter clicked. Yet the photographs were only a shard of a much longer sequence of events, a frozen moment extracted from motion and stripped of causality. The reality behind them unfolded under pressure, in circumstances where instinct overrode deliberation and safety eclipsed reputation. The kiss, which would soon be dissected and weaponized, was not an act of desire but a desperate improvisation, a split-second decision made to defuse a threat that left no time for explanation. Alternatively, the image capturing Carter pulling Electra out of danger, his grip firm and urgent, was not a lover's gesture but a rescuer's reflex. In either version of events, the lens betrayed the truth by narrowing it. What the camera framed as scandal was, in lived reality, a response to fear. But scandal does not ask permission to be nuanced. It feeds on contrast and power imbalance, on the spectacle of a woman seen standing beside a man whose status dwarfs her own. Carter's presence come under pressure, authoritative in crisis, became the perfect counterpoint to Will's absence. That contrast did the rest. Without hearing Electra's voice or understanding the context, the public imagination filled in the gaps with familiar tropes, ambition masquerading as affection, convenience disguised as chemistry, loyalty traded for leverage. Once the idea took root, it spread with alarming speed, infecting private conversations and public perceptions alike. For Will, the damage was immediate and deeply personal. He was not confronted merely with images, he was confronted with the collapse of his ability to trust his own emotional compass. Until that moment, his understanding of Electra had been anchored in shared history and mutual endurance. They had survived manipulation, external threats, and the corrosive effects of rumor before. Yet this time, the evidence arrived dressed in the authority of visual proof. Photographs, after all, feel definitive. They do not blink or hesitate. They appear to confirm what words might deny. And so Will found himself caught in the most painful paradox of all, knowing someone intimately while being confronted with something that seemed to contradict everything he believed. The tragedy did not lie in whether Electra had betrayed him. It lay in Will's growing inability to distinguish between affection and artifact, between the woman he loved and the narrative imposed upon her by circumstance and timing. Each glance at the images reopened the wound, not because they revealed desire, but because they replaced memory with doubt. The human mind, under stress, clings to what feels concrete. In this case, the photographs became anchors, dragging Will's thoughts away from context and toward suspicion. He replayed moments, re-examined conversations, and searched for signs he might have missed, all while the images whispered their silent accusations. Electra, meanwhile, found herself suffocating beneath a version of events she did not recognize. The cruelty of the situation was not merely that she was misunderstood, but that she was rendered voiceless by the very tools that condemned her. Any attempt to explain risked sounding defensive, and any delay in explanation allowed the narrative to harden further. She understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone, that truth delivered too late can be indistinguishable from a lie. Each passing hour deepened the chasm between her lived experience and the story being told about her. Dylan's role in this unfolding drama was neither purely malicious nor entirely innocent. Her decision to release the images at that precise moment was driven by a complicated mix of insecurity, self-preservation, and an unspoken need to control a narrative that felt increasingly beyond her grasp. Whether she intended to implicate Electra directly or merely sought to shift attention away from herself, the effect was the same. The photographs became catalysts, transforming private chaos into public spectacle. In doing so, Dylan underestimated the destructive force of partial truth. She did not merely expose a moment, she altered trajectories, reshaping how others would interpret every interaction that followed. As Carter navigated the legal storm drawing him back to Forrester Creations, he remained largely unaware of the emotional wreckage forming in his wake. His actions, measured and professional, were stripped of intention and recast as opportunism. Power, once perceived, is difficult to separate from motive. In the public imagination, Carter's authority became inseparable from desire, his intervention indistinguishable from pursuit. The irony was bitter. A man acting to prevent harm found himself implicated in it, his integrity questioned by a frame that captured urgency but erased purpose. The deeper this crisis unfolded, the clearer it became that the true conflict was not external but internal. Will's struggle was not with Electra's fidelity, but with his own perception. Love demands faith, yet faith becomes fragile when confronted with evidence that appears irrefutable. He oscillated between wanting to believe the woman he knew and fearing that belief would make him complicit in his own humiliation. Every instinct urged him to protect his heart, even if that protection meant doubting the person he cared for most. Electra's pain mirrored his, though it took a different form. She was forced to confront the terrifying realization that trust, once destabilized, can crumble without a single spoken accusation. The images did not need commentary, they spoke for themselves, loudly and destructively. Her efforts to reach Will were met with hesitation rather than rejection, a silence more devastating than anger. Silence suggested deliberation, the weighing of possibilities, the slow erosion of certainty. In that silence, Electra understood that the greatest casualty of the scandal was not her reputation but the intimacy she and Will had painstakingly built. The photographs continued to circulate, divorced entirely from their origin. Each share, each comment, further entrenched a version of reality that privileged appearance over intention. In that environment, truth became an uphill battle against momentum. Context required time and patience, commodities in short supply when scandal promised instant clarity. The more Electra tried to hold onto the complexity of what had occurred, the more she felt reduced to a caricature, her motives simplified and her agency questioned. What made the situation unbearable was the knowledge that even a full explanation might not restore what had been lost. Trust, once fractured, rarely returns to its original shape. Even if Will came to understand the circumstances, the images would linger as reminders of vulnerability moments when fear and urgency had collided with perception. The question ceased to be whether Electra had crossed a line and became whether Will could ever again separate what he felt from what he had seen. In the end, the unfolding tragedy revealed a harsh truth about evidence and emotion. Photographs capture light, not intention. They freeze seconds, not stories. Yet, when introduced at the wrong moment, they can overpower years of shared experience. Dylan's timing, Carter's presence, Electra's vulnerability, and Will's exhaustion converged into a perfect storm where interpretation outran understanding. The scandal was not born from betrayal but from compression from the reduction of a complex reality into a single, damning frame. As the aftermath continued to ripple outward, the characters found themselves standing amid ruins that none of them had consciously built. The most devastating consequence was not public judgment, but private confusion. Will's heart, once guided by instinct, now hesitated at every turn. Electra's voice, once trusted, now struggled to rise above the noise of images that refused to explain themselves. And somewhere within that silence lay the true tragedy, not the possibility that Electra had betrayed Will, but the possibility that love itself could be undone by a moment torn from its context and presented as proof. The scandal did not erupt out of nowhere. It detonated along an old fault line that had never truly healed. In the world of the bold and the beautiful, memory is never passive, and the past is not content to remain buried. For Electra Forrester, images have always carried a particular terror, a power to rewrite reality with ruthless efficiency. Years earlier, her reputation had been dragged through a public trial by pixels-edited frames, AI-assisted distortions, and a humiliating spectacle that taught her a cruel lesson. When the world decides to believe what it sees, truth becomes negotiable. That wound never closed. It calcified into vigilance, into a careful relationship with visibility, into a deep fear that her body and her face could be weaponized again. And this time, the weapon was aimed with surgical precision. When Dylan released the photographs, she did not rely on ambiguity. She relied on clarity so aggressive it felt incontestable. The images were bright, sharp, and synchronized timestamps aligned, locations corroborated, angles repeating the same story from different vantage points. They did not look like accidents or misunderstandings. They looked like documentation. Each frame appeared to complete the others, building a narrative that left no room for doubt. The kiss, captured mid-motion, seemed undeniable. The proximity suggested intention. The sequence suggested continuity. In a digital culture trained to distrust the artificial, Dylan offered what looked like the opposite, daylight certainty. This was not merely an attack on Electra's present. It was an assault that reached backward, reopening a scar Dylan knew existed. Electra's history with manipulated images had taught her how the court of public opinion works. The more passionately the accused denies, the more convincing the evidence appears. Protest becomes performance. Explanation becomes evasion. Dylan's strategy exploited that psychology with devastating effectiveness. By flooding the narrative with images that appeared so consistent, so meticulously aligned, she ensured that any claim of tampering would sound like a reflexive lie. The desperate protest of someone caught in the act. Electra felt it immediately, the familiar vertigo of being trapped inside someone else's story. Each attempt to assert context collapsed under the weight of visual repetition. She could explain the circumstances: panic, danger, a split-second decision meant to deflect a threat, or the moment when Carter Walton had pulled her to safety, but the images did not explain themselves. They accused. They flattened nuance. They rendered intention invisible. The more Electra tried to articulate what had actually happened, the more she seemed to confirm the narrative that the photographs insisted upon. In this logic, innocence required silence, yet silence implied guilt. There was no safe posture left. The situation escalated from scandal to psychological siege when an expert entered the conversation and did what experts are trained to do: slow the rush to judgment. A specialist in digital forensics examined the images and identified irregularities, microscopic inconsistencies in compression, subtle anomalies in lighting continuity, traces that suggested intervention rather than pure capture. The findings did not declare the images fake in the crude sense. They suggested something more disturbing. The photos were real, but altered. Not crudely doctored, not obviously generated, but refined massage by tools sophisticated enough to leave only faint fingerprints. For a brief, fragile moment, Electra felt air return to her lungs. The possibility of proof offered a lifeline, a chance to reclaim the narrative from the machinery that had swallowed it. Yet that hope evaporated almost as soon as it formed. Because whoever had orchestrated the release had anticipated this move. They had prepared not just images, but a counter-reality. The anti-rebuttal arrived with chilling efficiency, pristine metadata sets, corroborating device logs, synthetic location histories, and timestamped activity records that aligned perfectly with the altered visuals. The data did not merely defend the images, it attacked the challenge. It reframed the experts' concerns as overreach, painting forensic doubt as academic nitpicking against a mountain of corroboration. In this version of events, the images were not only authentic, they were over-authenticated. The perfection itself became the shield. Any claim of manipulation now required believing in a conspiracy so elaborate that it sounded implausible to anyone unwilling to sit with complexity. Electra's nightmare crystallized into its cruelest form. She was no longer fighting photographs. She was fighting a system designed to make lies indistinguishable from truth. The more evidence she marshaled, the more the counter-evidence appeared, immaculate and persuasive. The past repeated itself, but with an upgrade. Where once crude edits had humiliated her, now elegance condemned her. Where once she could point to obvious seams, now the seams were hidden by design. Caught in the crossfire was Will Spencer, whose private agony became the quiet engine of the story. Will did not want to be a juror. He wanted to be a partner. He knew Electra's history, knew what images had done to her before, and yet he was confronted with a presentation so thorough it short-circuited instinct. The photographs asked him to choose between empathy and evidence, between memory and metadata. Love urged him to trust the woman he knew. Reason urged him to respect what looked incontrovertible. Each time he leaned toward one, the other pulled him back. The tragedy was not that Will doubted Electra. It was that doubt itself had been engineered. The strategy did not require him to disbelieve her outright. It required only that he hesitate. That hesitation widened into silence, and silence became distance. In the gap, the images did their work, replaying in his mind with the authority of proof. The human heart, faced with uncertainty, often clings to what can be seen. The heart, too, can be trained. Electra experienced that distance as a second violation. She understood intellectually why Will struggled. She understood how compelling the evidence looked. But understanding did not dull the pain of being filtered through a dossier instead of believed as a person. Every conversation felt like a deposition. Every reassurance felt provisional. She was no longer Electra, partner and confidant. She was Electra, case file. As the narrative hardened, the scandal revealed its true design. It was never meant to prove infidelity. It was meant to establish Electra as unreliable. Once labeled a liar, she could be dismissed regardless of what she said next. Truth would become a moving target, always outrun by better prepared falsehoods. The perfect data did not exist to tell a story. It existed to end one. Dylan's role, whether driven by calculation, fear, or a need to control the fallout of her own vulnerability, became inseparable from the outcome. By selecting clarity over ambiguity and preparation over impulse, she ensured that any defense would look like deflection. The brilliance of the maneuver lay in its restraint. No wild accusations, no sensational captions, just images, timestamps, and silence. Let the audience do the rest. In the aftermath, the question that haunted everyone was no longer whether the photographs were real, but whether reality itself had become contestable beyond repair. Electra's past with AI humiliation transformed from context into curse, turning her credibility into a liability. Each reminder of that history was used against her, proof that she had cried manipulation before, proof that she would cry it again. The circle closed, airtight and merciless. What remained was a bleak revelation about modern scandal. That innocence is not disproved, it is overwhelmed. By the time explanations arrive, belief has already chosen sides. The story did not explode because Electra betrayed Will. It exploded because a system was built to make her denial indistinguishable from deceit. In that system, love is collateral damage, expertise is neutralized, and truth becomes an artifact, something curated, packaged, and released at the right moment. And so the tragedy reached its quiet crescendo. Electra stood amid immaculate lies that looked like facts, fighting not for forgiveness but for the right to be heard. Will stood between the woman he loved and the evidence he was trained to trust, discovering too late that certainty can be manufactured. The images continue to circulate, flawless and damning, while the truth messy, contextual, humans struggle to survive in their shadow.
Oh.